Right, so now we're going to look at the box model, which really, with front-end web development, is one of them things that's so fundamental, because if you don't understand the box model, you'll likely get into, not trouble, but you'll likely get into problems along the way when you're learning, which it will be extremely difficult to try and understand if you don't understand the fundamentals of the box model. So basically, the box model is how elements sit or display on the page depending on the properties that you give them. And we'll be looking at adding margin to an element, we'll be looking at adding padding, and we'll be looking at adding borders. So we'll also learn an additional CSS property while we explain the box model. So don't let this overwhelm you. It's one of them things that once you get it, you'll just completely understand it. At first it might seem a little bit tricky, but don't let that hold you back. So I'm going to create a div element, and I'm going to give this a class of, say, well, it could be anything. We'll just call this container. I could call it box, but that could confuse. So inside of here, I'm just going to say, hello world. So on the page as it stands, we don't have any styling. It's just giving us the element here on the page. Now I'm going to use something called Web Developer Tools, which is, we're going to look at this in the next part. We're going to look at how we can change styles within the browser dynamically. We're going to look at how resources are loaded in, etc. But for now, just understand that when I say green means this and orange means that, we're just looking at this from a visual point of view. So let's inspect this element. We can right click, and if you're not using Chrome, I'd probably recommend you do for the tools. Firefox is also good. You can download an extension for Firefox called Firebug, which lets you basically inspect elements like I'm doing now. But in my experience, Chrome is the easiest to get started with. So we're going to right click on this element and click Inspect Element. Now what's going to do is bring up our Developer Tools panel, and we can see all of the markup that we've actually created here within our page. And you can see that we've got the HTML, and when I hover over this, we get a blue area. When I hover over head, we don't get anything because the head isn't visible to us on the actual page. But when I hover over the body, you can see that we get that blue there. We've also got some orange around it, and the container here just sits blue. Now what I want to do is, with the container, I want to add a margin. Then I want to add some padding, and we'll take a look at how this affects the view of it on the page. So we've got our div with the class of container. Let's do a class selector here and say padding of 20 pixels and margin of 20 pixels. And we'll look at what these do. So you can see this has been significantly pushed down the page, and that's because we have green, which is our padding, and orange, which is our margin. Now margin is the spacing outside of the element. So anything outside of the element, it pushes it away from other elements, it's pushing it away from its parent container. The green is the padding, which is the space between the content within that element and the elements within it. So in this case, you can see is pushing the text hello world away from the edge of the container. Now this all might be a little bit easier to see if we had a border on here. So let's look at this CSS property. Now what I'm about to write is called a shorthand CSS property. It basically means that I'm combining lots of different CSS properties into one. And in this case, actually, we're using CSS shorthand properties here, padding. So I could do padding left, 20 pixels, padding right, 20 pixels, padding top, 20 pixels, and padding bottom, 20 pixels. Now, if all of these values are 20 pixels, what's the point in doing left, right, top, bottom, and explicitly defining each one? Well, there isn't. So we just say padding 20 pixels. We can also do things like padding 10 pixels, 20 pixels, which would essentially set the top and the bottom to 10 pixels and the left and the right to 20 pixels. And we can also do This is north, or the top, east, which is the right, south, which is the bottom, and west, which is obviously the left. So we could do something like 20 pixels, 20 pixels, 20 pixels, and 20 pixels. But of course, that's still pointless. So we just do 20 pixels like that. And it's exactly the same thing for the margin as well. Now with the border, we can say things like border width, 1 pixel. Let's take a look at what that's done. Nothing, because we've not defined a border color. So for example, if I define that as 000, let's take a look at this. There we go, nothing still, because we haven't defined a border style. In this case, I'm going to say it's solid. Now we see the black border. So we've got a solid border of 1 pixel and it's colored black. So the container now, this makes it a little bit easier to see where the padding and the margin sit. You can see the green area is within the actual element itself, and the orange is outside of it. Now the margin doesn't really affect the box model of this element, and we'll understand what the box model is in just a moment. I'm going to get rid of all of this, and I'm going to go back to where we started. So I'm going to give this a background of, I don't know, 999. I'm then going to give it a width of 100 pixel, a nice round number that we can work with, and I'm going to give it a height of 100 pixel as well. So we've now got a grey box. If we hover over it, you can see that Chrome Developer Tools nicely gives us the pixel width of this element. And you can see here within that yellow little speech bubble thing coming down, we have a div with a class of container, and we have the size of it at 100 pixels by 100 pixels. So we know that this now is 100 pixel by 100 pixels. That's it. Now let's go ahead and add a border like we did before, but let's add the let's use the shorthand border property. So instead of saying border width 1 pixel, border color black, border style solid, and just by the way, you can use things like dotted and dashed. We're going to just say border 1 pixel, which is the width, solid, which is the type, and color. So there we go, that's the shorthand property for border. So now we get the following. You can now see we've got this black border around it. In actual fact, let's set this to 2 pixels, just so we can see the border a little bit better. Okay, so now I'm going to hover over this. Now you'll notice that the size of the container has changed. That is obvious because what's happened is we've added a 2 pixel border on every side to the square, which has increased it by 4 pixels in its width and 4 pixels in its height. You might be thinking, well, what's the problem with this? That's obvious. Well, to some people, and you know, when you're developing on the internet, you might not think it's a problem. But let's say you had exactly 100 pixel space to place an element. What would happen is if you were to add a border to that, it would push over that 100 pixel size, and you'd be left with some kind of problem, maybe a layout problem or something like that. So this is basically the box model. If we look under computed here, you can see that we've got 100 by 100 in here. We've got 2 by 2 for the, or 2 pixel border for the border here. The margin, there's nothing, and the padding, there's also nothing. So now let's go ahead and add some padding, and we'll see how this gets even more problematic. Say I want a padding of 10 pixels. I'd expect the hello world text to move inwards, but in this case it does, but the size of the container also changes to 124 pixels by 124 pixels. You can now start to see how annoying this might get. Now there are a couple of ways that we can actually remedy this. Let's say I still want a border on my element, and I still want padding on my element, but I want it to be 100 pixels width and 100 pixels height, no question about it. I can do some calculations in here. I could say that 10 times 2, e.g. the padding on the left, the padding on the right, and then the padding on the top and bottom, increasing that by a 20 pixel size, I could then minus 20 pixels from both the height and the width, which would still give me the padding and leave me with the 100 by 100. In this case, it's not 100 by 100 because we've got 104 by 104 because of the border. So we could further cater for that and say, well, I want it to be 78 by 78. Like that. So now, oops, sorry, no, it's not, is it? It's 76 because it's 4 pixels each way, like so. So now we've ended up with a container that's still 100 pixels. However, we've still got that padding in there, which is pushing the text away from the inside of the element. And we have the border on there without affecting the actual size of the element. And that is basically what the box model is. Now, if we add some margin to the container, this is on the outside of the element, remember. So really, it doesn't affect the actual size of the container. It's the orange spacing you see around the outside. Now, the reason you see the orange spacing go all the way to the right is because this is a block level element that we've specifically defined as 100 pixel width, and therefore the rest of the space is just classed as a margin as orange. So you can come into your developer tools and look at each of these bits through here. But basically, once you've got that fundamental understanding, you should be able to use your developer tools and your knowledge of the box model to size things efficiently. Now what we're going to look at is a CSS property that allows us to basically just explicitly say, I want this to be 100 pixels width and 100 pixels height, and I want to add as many borders as I want in as many widths as I want, and I want to add as much padding as I want and not affect it. So let's return to 100% width, 100 pixel width, sorry, and 100 pixel height. And now let's look at adding some padding in here. So I'm going to add 20 pixel padding, and I'll add a 4 pixel solid black border. So you can imagine that, stretch that right out. We've got 148 by 148. But let's use and this is a relatively new property, so it won't work in older browsers like Internet Explorer because they don't have auto update enabled. So there'll be lots of people that are still using IE7 and IE8, and this is a massive issue within web development, is supporting all browsers. This will be supported in browsers like Safari, Firefox, Chrome, obviously. So we're going to say box sizing border box, and this alters the way that the padding and the border, change the box model. So now when I refresh, we've got a 100 pixel by 100 pixel element. We've got our padding in there, which we wanted. We've got our border in there, and it's not been affected. So just using that property. Now this property should be vendor prefix. We'll be looking at vendor prefixes later. So up to this point in the tutorial, don't rely on this property. If you run this through a CSS linter, which we'll also be discussing at the end of the series, you'll get a warning for this because it's not supported in older browsers. So if this isn't supported, it will basically not be read or not be taken into account by the browser's rendering engine, and it will probably break your layout. So if you want to be entirely careful about where you're supporting specific styles, you may want to go with the option that we looked at initially in this video part. So that is basically the box model. If you don't understand it, play around with some of the widths and the heights of an element, add some padding, add some border, add some margin, which doesn't really affect it, but then try and just sort of chop and change things around and get the hang of it.